Hi, I'm David Birchall, and this is a podcast for the week 3 topic in the Australian Politics Unit for autumn 2020 on Parramatta and Penrith and also Bankstown. Um, my topic today is, in 10 minutes or less, is what is liberal democracy? And I'm going to take us through some thoughts about democracy and its changing meanings over time, the idea of representative democracy and what that means, and from both of those things, the idea of liberal democracy, both as a kind of extension of the democratic idea and also perhaps as a qualification of it as well. And for this week's topic, we have up on views, and you should get hold of now if you haven't already, two readings. A chapter out of Bernard Crick's famous book in defense of politics from the early 1960s, and also a chapter by Narelle Meriglotta and others about democracy and liberalism in Australia. And for this pod I'm recording now, it's the Meriglotta et al. Reading that I'm particularly focusing on, though I'll be making some allusions to the other one as well. Okay, so you should see in front of you now, and I'm about to move from it, a PowerPoint screen with a summary of what I'm about to talk about. On the right-hand side of the screen there's a couple of individuals out of history. The ancient Greek Athenian statesman Pericles, he's the one with the helmet, of course, and to his bottom right, a rather serious and unhappy-looking John Stuart Mill from the 19th century. Back to them in a second. As Miraglotta and others note in the reading up on views for this week, the term democracy is an ancient one. It comes from ancient Greece and it means the rule of the people. And in ancient Greece, that means one thing it means the people of Athens in particular, to take the most famous example, meeting, as you'll see there on the right hand side of the screen, directly in real time to make face to face decisions in the assembly. Now, modern scholars trying to work out how this actually worked, and using the comparisons, amongst others, of modern football stadiums, have tried to calculate how many people could meet in the assembly, and we're talking about a matter of thousands. So a modest suburban football stadium would have done the same work. And so right away you can see some issues to do with the ancient Greek democratic model compared with ours. So that's the first stop point there. The second one is decisions, or many, not all decisions, important decisions are made by the people face to face in the assembly, the ecclesia in Athens, as it was called, and they do that by sticking little chits in containers for yes or no. But democracy also meant a system of lot, which is a random selection for the filling of public positions, which is still the way we choose juries today. And jury service is probably the only real survivor we have in our modern political and legal systems of direct democracy in the ancient sense. And so even the Athenian state in ancient Greece is kind of democratic in its composition because the people randomly staff a whole bunch of positions which these days we would call professional ones in the public service, we would say. So the assembly is all volunteers, that's the people who come to meet, and they represent the citizenry. Any adult male citizen can come to the assembly in Athens and talk and vote. That means free adult males. But of course, in practice, most people probably couldn't at any one moment because they were busy doing their working day and perhaps lived a long way away. So the people means whoever can actually get there at that moment. Fourth stop point. In ancient political thought, democracy is not a system of government as such, and democracies often did things by completely different means. Democracy really means the composition of the people making the decisions. Democracy means the rule of the many or the people. Aristocracy meant the rule of the few, who might be aristocrats or they might be called by some other names. And if there was a rule of one person, conventionally it was called a monarchy. So it's about power rather than processes. Saying that something is democratic in the ancient world doesn't specify exactly how the decisions get made. It more says who they get made by. In ancient political thought, there are arguments about different ways of doing things, about what we might call systems of government. And often there, the emphasis is on some notion of balance. what's sometimes called a mixed constitution was often thought to be best, such as by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, because it balanced different elements of the constitution, but also because it balanced different elements of the population, the few, the many, and the one. And out of that balance supposedly came stability. Now, even in the ancient Mediterranean world, democracy was controversial. There weren't that many democracies in the ancient world. That's why we keep looking to the places that were, like Athens, and to some extent some of the other Greek city-states. And when they were democracies, often they didn't last for that long, decades or a century. Often then they fell into back into some sort of rule, and democracy might or not be restored later on. One of the major problems that people imagined with democracy in the ancient world was instability. I'll come back to that. The most famous example of the functioning of a democracy in the ancient world is Thucydides' ancient book on the Peloponnesian War from the 5th century BCE or CE. And Thucydides structures his book partly as a description of Athenian democracy and a praise of Athenian democracy, but also he involves within this praise a long series of extended criticisms of democracy as well. Particularly, he presents the people as a troublesome element in democratic rule because the people, the demos, in Thucydides' eyes, are uneducated and maybe not focused on politics, and so they can be excitable, changeable, volatile, easily swayed. Thucydides appears to be saying that democracy, in the sense in which he uses the word direct democracy, only works when the leaders in the assembly are calm, rational folks who don't attempt to rouse the passions of the people too much and instead attempt to explain things to them clearly and reasonably, giving all sides of the question. His hero, on the right-hand side of the screen there, is Pericles, an orator whom he believes, and leader whom he believes exemplifies this way of doing things. Yet in Thucydides' view, Athenian democracy, and maybe democracy in general, too often falls into the hands of what the Greeks called demagogues, meaning irresponsible individuals who roused the passions of the people, the demos, and directed anger towards outsiders very often, such as foreigners or subject peoples of the Athenian Empire, for instance. And in Thucydides' story, the villain is a demagogue called Cleon, who does exactly that. He exercises sway over the people by focusing on hated figures, both inside and outside the Athenian state. And ultimately, in Thucydides' view, it's demagogues more than anything else who bring down Athens from within as much as, if not more, as foreign armies at the gates of Athens. Now, it's notable that when we read these ancient stories today, we're really struck, it's hard not to be struck, by the parallels between political debates we have right now. We live in a world, as it's often described in the last few years, of political populism. It seems to be a populist moment in particularly modern Western history, and important leaders of important countries around the world right now do often deliberately adopt a kind of populist model, and this term's often been applied to President Donald Trump of the United States and Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom. I'll leave the list at two, and I think it's worth us thinking about what's similar and what's different between what they do and what was called demagoguery in the ancient world. Now, in the 18th century, the 1700s, the idea of democracy revives after a long eclipse through many centuries where monarchy and princedom were the rule. But in the 18th century, in the period of the American French Revolutions, it's a new idea of democracy which comes to the fore. In fact, it's often not called democracy at all. It's called representative government. And in representative government, the people don't speak directly on their own behalf in the assembly. Rather, they gather to elect representatives who then make decisions on their behalf. So the people make a decision. The decision is to elect other people to make further decisions. The most obvious argument, and I think the one that stands out to us today for why representative democracy has triumphed in the modern world, is simply scale. Athens is a city of a few 100,000 people at the very most, and the number of people who had to gather to make decisions was often only perhaps a few thousand, perhaps 10 to 20,000 max. That's not the way you run modern, complex, large geographical states. Certainly not somewhere like the United States. It's vast territory. And so clearly, representative democracy meets the needs of large, extended territorial states. But third dot point, representation didn't only become important in the 18th century because of geography and the size of modern states. It was also thought to be an antidote to the perils of ancient democracy. Those criticisms already mentioned by Thucydides and others were still alive in the very ancient, focused minds of 18th century political scholars and politicians. And representative government was also thought to be an improvement, actually, not just a cut down version, but an improvement on ancient democracy, because representatives elected by the people, it was hoped, would be cooler and more rational in the decisions they made, because they would have more time to think about them and they were at some distance from the consequences. So they could act disinterestedly, as they used to say in the 18th century. In other words, without regard to their own personal interests. In the debates around the United States Constitution in the 1780s, the first truly modern constitution that you can call, I think, fully representative government, the system of government that the United States still has today is often described as a kind of mixed government on the ancient model. So the House of Representatives, like our House of Representatives in Australia, is thought of as the People's House. The Senate is thought of as an aristocratic institution by some early American authors. And the presidency is thought of as a little bit like a monarchy, though not an actual monarchy. And you can see echoes of some of those ideas in our own federal constitution. There is a head of state who is not the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister has very limited roles under the Constitution. The House of Representatives is still sometimes referred to as the People's House. And while the method of electing the Senate has changed in all sorts of ways over the last century or so, the Senate is still not the People's House in the same way. Very often it's referred to as the State's House, not an aristocratic institution, but not strictly speaking a democratic one either, since obviously, as you're probably aware, Tasmanians effectively have many more votes than, for instance, Victorians or New South Wales people do. In the 19th century, representative government starts to turn into what's called modern democracy. And you'll be aware from the last couple of weeks, that in Australia, that starts to take shape around about the 1850s, in fact. We are one of the earliest modern democracies in the world, along with New Zealand. In most parts of Europe, there was a much slower process. And the voting franchise, who was entitled to vote, grows often quite slowly amidst fears on the part of particularly well-to-do people that something terrible is going to happen if everyone gets the vote at once. So some of the concerns raised by Thucydides reared their heads again. But there are also new concerns that emerge in the 19th century. And the most important, famous person articulating these, bottom right-hand corner there, is the philosopher John Stuart Mill, whose book On Liberty from the late 1850s, the same period as in Australia, articulates new worries about, as it were, the tyranny of the majority. That if you have a system of government based much more on the rule of 50% plus one than previously, what does this mean for minorities? Not just socioeconomic minorities, the rich, but other kinds of minorities as well. People who live unusual lifestyles or have minority beliefs. For instance, in 19th century England, people of minority religious beliefs, atheists, such as John Stuart Mill himself, or people whose sexualities or ethnic identities may have been different as well, since these were the issues in the 19th century as they are today. The principle that John Stuart Mill famously articulated in On Liberty was that everyone in what we would call a liberal democracy should be free to pursue their own good unless it causes actual harm to others. In other words, there should be a whole series of buffers in the legal and political system to protect individuals and minorities, and particularly unpopular minorities, from the tyranny of the majority on the basis that they cause no harm. Why shouldn't they be left alone? The harm principle is still often invoked today as a core principle of liberal democracy, and it's worth us thinking about why that is still an issue today, I think. So, last PowerPoint into the discussion. Liberal democracy, in a sense, is an evolution of the idea of democracy to take account of some of the worries that Thucydides and others expressed as far back as ancient Greece. But it also brings into the fray, I think, new worries and anxieties that have developed over the last couple of hundred years. A concern for the freedom of individuals against the freedom of the group, a concern for the freedom of minorities against the freedom of the majority, and a concern for the freedom of people whose lifestyles offend other people against those who feel offended. And this is built into our constitution in Australia, arguably in several different ways. Most important being the separation of powers, which separates the legislature, um, the body making the laws, from the executive, the body executing the laws, and most importantly for these purposes, from the legal system that enforces the laws and imposes punishments for breaking them. Also in Australia, fourth dot point there, it's regarded as an important principle that the public service, the people who implement the laws in practice, are understood not to be political figures. It's conventional that they shouldn't belong to a political party, for instance, at least if they're senior public servants, and that the processes of the administration of laws should be kept rigorously distinct as far as possible from political processes. So when politicians meddle in sports grants, for instance, that's a kind of separation, violation of the separation of powers. However, last dot point and final thought, all of these ideas remain controversial. The independence that judges assert under our system from political interference sometimes annoys people. Judges not infrequently hand down more lenient sentences for particular crimes than the public would like, and make decisions that are unpopular, as do juries as well, as it happens, by the way. And in the United States in particular, the Trump administration has much more aggressively tried to remodel the public service there into a band of loyalists to the government of the day, which has always been an issue or a problem in American public life, but clearly is a much more controversial one now. You could also argue in this country over the last few decades, the independence of the public service has been compromised in certain respects, which becomes an issue for liberal democracy. All of these things I think are worth thinking about for tutorials this week. See some of you then. Take care.